The story of James McGill is a profoundly deep and tragic one. Better Call Saul does an impeccable job portraying the innocence that was lost within Jimmy that eventually devolved him into the Saul Goodman that we know from Breaking Bad. Although there are many dominoes that fall throughout Jimmy's story, there's one key disgraceful act that Jimmy did where, at the time, just seemed like a small petty low blow, but wound up affecting and causing multiple character deaths throughout the show. So, what is Jimmy's worst regret? Stick around as we discuss what it is, how it impacted many moving parts throughout the entire series, along with if he could ever redeem himself for it.
I just thought you should know that.
That you have regrets?
Yeah, I have regrets.
Why? Why have regrets at all? What's the point?
You are talking about regrets, so if you want to ask about regrets, just ask about regrets and leave all this time-traveling nonsense out of it.
Okay, regrets.
Regrets?
Yeah.
That's it, buddy.
What else?
Nothing you change.
If you don't like where you're heading, there's no shame in going back and changing your path.
When have you ever changed your path?
We always end up having the same conversation, don't we?
Hey guys, Q here. In this video, I'll be analyzing an unknowingly important decision that Jimmy made back in Better Call Saul Season 3, linking it to multiple character deaths throughout the show, along with its conclusion during the Better Call Saul series finale. Like the video if you end up enjoying it, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on Twitter for more Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad content. With that being said, let's jump into the breakdown. With spoiler warnings out of the way, I'll stop being so vague about the subject and get down to brass tacks. The disgraceful act that Jimmy committed in Season 3 happens at the end of episode 307, and it involves Jimmy messing with Chuck's malpractice insurance by intentionally throwing Chuck under the bus to hurt him. The family vendetta between Chuck versus Jimmy is honestly a huge back and forth rabbit hole to go down in regard to who's truly to blame for what, but let me just set the stage for this particular moment in time. Chuck had betrayed Jimmy by secretly recording his confession about swapping the Mesa Verde numbers and took him to court because of it. Although Jimmy wasn't disbarred like Chuck wanted, Jimmy was still suspended from the law for a year as a result of these events. Jimmy essentially had to uproot his life for the next year and became very stressed and depressed over many problems that may have seemed minor on their own, but when all piled together on his shoulders at the same time, became too much for him to handle. These mostly consisted of Jimmy being given a hard time everywhere he looked, from losing his office or his community service hours being unrightfully cut, along with various money problems with his malpractice insurance being the final straw to break the camel's back. Since Jimmy was dealing with all of this hardship due to Chuck's actions against him, causing him to become suspended from the law, during this rock bottom moment, Jimmy decided to indirectly take his frustration out on Chuck by messing with his insurance. At the time, it seemed like a minor and insignificant low blow that Jimmy did in order to get back at Chuck for putting him in this situation, but over time it unintentionally became the catalyst for what ruined both Chuck and Howard's lives. Although at the time of it happening, it seemed relatively insignificant, as time went on, Jimmy realized that it actually may have been his deepest and darkest secret and regret. Jimmy kept what he did to himself throughout the entire show, never acknowledging it or telling anyone the truth, to the point that it seemed like Jimmy could have potentially kept the secret to his grave. Jimmy's secret about messing with Chuck's insurance became one of the most darkest secrets throughout the entirety of Better Call Saul, with many fans wondering if anyone would ever find out what Jimmy truly did. With the stage now set, during the rest of this video, I'll discuss the action itself in depth and break down whether it was premeditated or in the moment, how it affected major characters such as Chuck, Howard, and Kim, along with analyzing Jimmy finally admitting what he did while in court during the Better Call Saul series finale. So first off, let's discuss the scene itself that involves Jimmy messing with Chuck's insurance. Since Jimmy wasn't going to practice law for the next year due to being suspended, he went to his insurance company to try and do something about it. Jimmy tells the insurance lady to look up his name McGill, to which she finds Chuck first, and Jimmy corrects her how that's his brother and to look up James McGill instead. Jimmy explains that his license has been suspended for a year, but he's denied a refund. Yet another moment where he can't catch a break. Not only will she not refund his insurance or put it on hold, she tells him that once he's reinstated, his insurance will increase by 150% due to the suspension. Jimmy starts breaking down, and Bob Odenkirk's acting here is brilliant. Jimmy starts venting to the insurance lady about all of his problems, including Chuck. Jimmy lets it slip that Chuck is mentally ill and that he had a mental breakdown in court. The insurance lady takes note of this, but Jimmy notices and tells her not to do anything since he doesn't want to get Chuck in trouble because of him. As Jimmy leaves, he shows a huge grin on his face, implying how getting Chuck in trouble is actually exactly what he wanted to do. And it's it's an amazing way to end off the episode. Back when Better Call Saul Season 3 was originally airing in 2017, I created an entire discussion video breaking down Jimmy at the insurance company. My original interpretation was that Jimmy thought about doing this in the moment, but I had gotten many comments stating that they thought Jimmy went into that meeting with this plan to screw over Chuck already in mind. This really got me thinking about it over and over again, going in circles to the point that I was now undecided on Jimmy's true intentions myself. Years have passed since then, with multiple seasons coming and going, but while doing my season 3 tier list, I rewatched back up to this point and started thinking down the rabbit hole about this debate all over again. So let's answer the burning question once and for all. Was Jimmy's plan to mess with Chuck's malpractice insurance premeditated, or something that he thought of on the spot while in the moment? As I summarized earlier, during the entirety of episodes 306 and 307, Jimmy was given the short end of the stick time and time again, with the insurance being the final straw to break the camel's back.
I'm just having a rough time. Just need a break. I'm getting run out on this community service, getting ripped off left and right, and my car won't start. My gal is disappointed in me, and
the main reason why people believe Jimmy messing over Chuck's insurance was premeditated is due to the fact that he first told the woman to look up McGill without saying his full name.
just look up my name, McGill.
Charles McGill of Hamlin McGill?
No, that's my brother. I'm Jimmy. James McGill, solo practitioner.
Could have been Jimmy double checking to see if Chuck had the same insurance company as him, confirming that he can screw over Chuck here. When Jimmy starts breaking down and venting about all his problems, I really believed him in this moment, but then when he starts sobbing over Chuck, the lines blur and it starts becoming obvious that he's throwing Chuck under the bus.
He had a complete mental breakdown at the bar hearing.
Your brother, he had a breakdown in court?
It's in the transcripts.
Then there's also the smile at the end, possibly indicating that the plan that he had all along worked. So although Jimmy could have went to this insurance company with the idea to screw over Chuck already in mind, I don't think that's the case, as I really do believe Jimmy just went there for his own reasons. Jimmy legitimately just wanted to go speak to someone at the insurance company in person due to constantly being put on hold while trying to work it out over the phone earlier on in the episode.
But yeah, well then may I please speak to someone who can make a decision? No, don't put me on hold again, please. Hello?
Whether Jimmy already knew that he and Chuck used the same insurance company, or if this was a surprise to him, is hearsay. The point is that Jimmy truly just said McGill for himself, and that the acknowledgement of Chuck also using the same insurance company could have initially planted the seed in his head for this idea to screw over Chuck right in this moment in time. I believe that Jimmy's breakdown in front of this insurance lady started out genuine, but then twisted and turned into a con with Jimmy suddenly deciding to throw Chuck under the bus after all the grief this suspension has caused him, not thinking that it would screw over Chuck as much as it truly ends up doing.
My gal is disappointed in me, and my brother is sick, and he's alone. I spent years caring for him, and now he hates me. The only family I got left, and he hates me. He hates my guts, and I pretend not to care, but he's my brother. How can I not?
It was a petty, split-second decision that Jimmy made against Chuck due to being at such a low point that caused him to break down, with the insurance being the final straw. So Better Call Saul 307 was written and directed by Tom Schnoz, and sometime in between seasons 4 and 6 of Better Call Saul, I actually recall Tom giving a definitive answer to this premeditated versus in-the-moment debate, but I couldn't remember where he said it. I listened to the entire Insider podcast for 307 just in case to see if I could find an answer, but they didn't even mention the insurance scene at all. So since the Insider podcast didn't give me any answers and I couldn't find any past interviews confirming it, I actually tweeted at Tom Schnoz back in June asking about it, and he was nice enough to respond. Tom said it was in the moment, which in my eyes definitely settles the debate once and for all, as this answer is coming from the writer and director of the episode. The answer may seem obvious to some of you, but I really gotta reiterate how huge of a debate this was back when season 3 was new. And yes, I originally did think that it was in the moment, but arguments within the fandom about it being premeditated were convincing enough to the point that, at the time, it was essentially a 50-50 split between the audience, with half thinking it was premeditated and the other half thinking it was in the moment. Now, some people believe that he went there originally plotting to sabotage Chuck, a lot of people actually, and that's fine, but I don't believe that that is the case. I feel like this was a spur-of-the-moment decision, considering that he had just realized that Chuck used the same insurance company as him when the woman looked up Chuck by accident first. Now, you're definitely open to your opinions, and I'm open to read any discussion you may have on the subject. As I said, this is a very debatable topic, and I think it's really interesting to discuss, but my opinions still stand with Jimmy never intending on going to the insurance place to screw Chuck over, and that he only did it because there was nothing else that he could do. The debate eventually fizzled out over the years as newer seasons were released, but creating my season 3 tier list really re-sparked this debate for me, so I'm happy to finally get confirmation on the true answer that the creators intended. Also, since I did create an entire video about this back in 2017 without ever truly pinning down which answer was correct, it felt great getting closure to it. I ended up rambling about this so much in my original draft for my season 3 tier list script that I decided to cut the discussion and make it into its own video due to the season 3 tier list already being such a long video. Oh, and also, even though Tom gave us a definitive answer, one of the many aspects that I love about this show is that there are multiple ways to interpret every situation within it that sparks many interesting debates within the fandom, creating really fun and intriguing discussion topics. With the main breakdown of the malpractice insurance situation out of the way, let's now begin to discuss how it deeply affected different characters on the show. Jimmy could have never predicted the domino effect of the insurance causing Howard to want Chuck to retire.
Chuck, you are the best legal mind I've ever known, hands down. But your decision-making has become unpredictable. I can't be partners with someone whose judgment I don't trust.
This created a feud between them, with Chuck blackmailing Howard.
You're suing Hamlin McGill.
Come on in, Howard. If you can't trust my judgment, as you say, so be it. But you're going to have to pay me for my share. I believe it comes to around $8 million. We both know the firm doesn't have the money.
You'd rather tear down HHM than retire.
Do you think I'm trouble now? As your partner? Imagine me as your enemy.
Resulting in Howard paying out of his own pocket to get Chuck to quit HHM.
$3 million.
The first of 3 payments, as per the partnership agreement.
The firm can't afford this. You're not shutting down, are you?
I would never endanger the firm. This is mostly from my personal funds and a few loans.
You're paying me out of your own pocket.
You won.
This forced Chuck to retire and lose the last thing he cared about in his life, along with what was most important to him, his career. Due to this, along with hatefully pushing away Jimmy during their final conversation, caused Chuck's condition to relapse to the point that he eventually takes his own life in the season 3 finale. Chuck had no one and nothing when he died. He pushed away his ex-wife, his only remaining family member, along with his best friend, which resulted in him losing his career. Granted, Chuck did die a millionaire, but as the saying goes, money can't buy happiness, especially in Chuck's case with his condition and where he had no one to enjoy it with and never really cared for fruitless spending. Jimmy messing with Chuck's insurance was in itself the final straw to break the camel's back in regard to Howard's partnership with Chuck.
You want me to retire over this? The insurance?
It's not just the insurance. That's the straw that broke the camel's back.
So this is about my condition. Look, Howard, I'm fine.
This is not what fine looks like.
It's not like Jimmy knocked over the lantern himself, but Jimmy's actions caused a domino effect that would eventually result in Chuck's death. Howard, of course, was unaware that it was Jimmy who messed with HHM's malpractice insurance, and Chuck died never knowing the truth. Jimmy had seen Chuck just a few days beforehand, and Chuck had all of his electronics fully plugged in and working. When Jimmy and Kim went to Chuck's burnt down house at the beginning of season 4, Jimmy realized that Chuck had somehow relapsed due to finding all of his electronics thrown out in the backyard. Jimmy knew that something must have happened that caused Chuck to relapse between the last time that he saw Chuck and Chuck's death. It's not until the end of episode 401 that Jimmy not only learns the surface reason why, but also the true reason which he is secretly guilty for.
I saw him 5 days ago. He was listening to jazz. All the lights worked. He was himself. Something must have happened. Something made him relapse.
This leads us to Howard. After Chuck's funeral, Howard confronted Jimmy and Kim at their apartment with a confession of his own that he believes pushing Chuck out of HHM caused Chuck to unalive himself. Jimmy and Kim believe this, that is until Jimmy learns the reason why Howard and Chuck even begun arguing over Chuck's retirement in the first place, which was of course the malpractice insurance.
He was improving until the thing with the insurance. So it wasn't the bar hearing.
The insurance?
It was a ridiculous thing.
Jimmy's ears perk up when he hears Howard mention this, and Jimmy gets Howard to elaborate on it, which is really the only time Jimmy ever speaks during this scene.
What about the insurance?
Our malpractice insurance. They found out about Chuck's condition and raised our rates. Chuck went ballistic. He wanted to go to war. I drew a line. He wouldn't back down, so I forced him out.
Once it's confirmed to Jimmy that his originally insignificant action to mess with Chuck's insurance unintentionally became the catalyst that caused the domino effects that led to Chuck's death, Jimmy keeps it to himself and allows Howard to take the burden of guilt over Chuck's death in his place. During Chuck's final conversation with Jimmy, Chuck told Jimmy that he hurts everyone around him and that he should just embrace it and skip the part where he feels remorse for it afterwards.
In the end, you're going to hurt everyone around you. You can't help it, so stop apologizing and accept it. Embrace it. Frankly, I'd have more respect for you if you did.
So in a way, Jimmy does exactly that by not telling Howard and Kim the truth about him being behind the insurance situation, ignoring the part that he secretly played in Chuck's death and pushing the blame onto Howard instead.
You hurt people over and over and over, and then there's this show of remorse.
It's not a show.
I know you don't think it's a show. I don't doubt your emotions are real. But what's the point of all the sad faces and the gnashing of teeth? If you're not going to change your behavior, and you won't, why not just skip the whole exercise?
This is why the final line of dialogue in 401 holds so much weight to it, as Jimmy tells Howard that it's his cross to bear, creating shocked looks on both Howard and Kim's faces, while Jimmy stands up to cheerfully whistle and offer them coffee.
It never occurred to me that I could hurt him. He always seemed so strong, but he wasn't. I think he did what he did because of me.
Well, Howard, I guess that's your cross to bear.
Since both Howard and Kim never knew the role that Jimmy truly played in all of this, it caused Howard to become incredibly remorseful for his actions, along with Kim lashing out on Howard for trying to make it right. Kim thought that Howard was just trying to unload his guilt and selfishly make himself feel better by telling Jimmy that Chuck unalived himself on the same day of Chuck's funeral, along with Howard giving sincere yet hollow gestures towards Jimmy after the fact. Although Kim believed that Howard was guilty for Chuck's death due to not knowing that Jimmy messed with HHM's insurance, I believe that Kim also felt guilt herself over what happened to Chuck, which may have been what caused her to lash out at Howard in the way that she did. During the back half of season 3, Kim showed many signs of feeling guilty over tearing down Chuck in court. We learned this from what she says to Paige after lashing out at her at Mesa Verde.
As far as I'm concerned, all we did was tear down a sick man.
Along with Kim bringing it up to Jimmy while they're out grabbing drinks together.
Nothing. What?
I keep thinking, was there another way?
Chuck? Is that what you're talking about? Kim, we did what we had to do.
But Rebecca...
Everything that happened was his own fault. Everything. You put him in the rearview mirror. He is not worth thinking about. Done.
Kim already felt bad enough about what they did to Chuck during the chicanery episode, but then Chuck's death, along with seeing Jimmy unable to properly process Chuck's death while being unaware as to why, finally tipped the scales for her, and we see this during the scene where Jimmy casually reads Chuck's final letter to him while Kim actually tears up. But back to Howard. Since he fully took the blame for Chuck's death, it caused him to become incredibly depressed and go through the stages of grief until he was finally able to come out the other side. During all this, Jimmy continuously blamed Howard for Chuck's death by twisting the knife and rubbing salt in the wound throughout seasons 4 to 5.
Fine. Your pain is very special. Woe is you. Just stop wallowing, okay? This place is all you've got.
Jimmy downplayed Chuck's death to Howard in season 4 in order to solidify him pushing blame onto Howard to avoid his own guilt in the situation.
And you're telling me this place is falling apart? Get your shit together, Howard.
Excuse me?
Oh, please. You suffer one little setback and you're gonna let your entire legacy go?
One little setback.
Also, seeing Howard become so distraught over the death of Chuck pushed Jimmy to solidify his decision to never wanting to work through his emotions himself. This was shown by Jimmy ripping up a number to a therapist after seeing how horrible Howard was doing when he saw Howard in the courthouse bathroom. Not only that, but Howard was able to properly process Chuck's death, something that Jimmy should have done but never did, due to never taking accountability for his own actions. Jimmy eventually resented Howard because of this and his new namaste lifestyle, resulting in Jimmy messing with Howard throughout season 5, all with once again blaming Howard for killing Chuck when Howard finally confronted Jimmy about messing with him.
Jimmy, I'm sorry you're in pain.
You're sorry? You kill my brother and you say you're sorry?
Moving on to season 6, during Howard's final monologue towards Jimmy and Kim at the end of episode 607, we learn the many hardships that Howard has had to go through in the past year or so, such as debt, depression, and marriage problems. In my opinion, all these troubles that Howard has had to deal with were all indirectly caused by Jimmy. This is because you can trace back all of these issues through the domino effect that happened as a result of Chuck's death, and Howard taking the blame for it, which, as we discussed, was caused by Jimmy allowing Howard to feel entirely guilty for Chuck's death, even though it was truly Jimmy's fault for messing with their insurance in the first place.
I've worked my way through worse. Debt, depression, my marriage falling apart. Oh, yeah. Been sleeping in the guest house for the better part of a year.
First off, Howard's debt, which was caused due to Howard paying Chuck out of his own pocket to retire from HHM after Chuck tried blackmailing him. Not only that, but the debt was also related to the downsizing that HHM went through due to Chuck leaving HHM, which Chuck even told Jimmy would happen way back in the very first episode.
In order to pay out my share, suppose my partners are forced to liquidate the firm. My clients are out in the cold. My cases are scattered to the winds. 126 people lose their jobs. What happens to your cronies in the mailroom? The assistants, paralegals, the janitorial staff, all of them out on the street.
Yeah, I see a lot of empty cubicles out there. What's going on?
We've had some setbacks.
Paying out to Chuck's estate?
That is part of it. The firm's reputation is not what it was.
So what's the plan?
The consultants call it right sizing.
We already discussed the depression that Howard went through due to Chuck's death, since he felt entirely guilty over it because Jimmy never spoke up to admit the part that he played in the insurance situation. Then there's Howard's marriage troubles, which some of you may be scratching your heads about how this could link back to Chuck's death. Well, in 607, Howard tells Jimmy and Kim that he's been sleeping in the guest house for the better part of a year. 607 happens in June of 2004, which means that Howard has been having marriage problems since at least the summer of 03. Although Howard mentioned sleeping in the guest house for the better part of a year, that doesn't mean that that's when his marriage problems started, only how that's when they got so bad to the point that he started sleeping separately from Cheryl. Chuck died in March of 2003, so it's possible that the grief and depression that Howard went through due to Chuck's death could have put a strain on his marriage with Cheryl. Not only that, but as we saw in episode 606, Cheryl was extremely cold and jaded to Howard's new namaste lifestyle, which Howard created as a coping mechanism to try and come out of the other side of his depression as a better man. Howard's marriage troubles being a result of Chuck's death could also be considered a hot take or a controversial take or maybe even a stretch, as I've mentioned it in previous videos, to receive both acceptance and disapproval, and it's never been officially confirmed by the creators, but in my opinion, I believe it to be true. Again, as I mentioned earlier, one of the many reasons why I love this show is the various ways that you can interpret these characters and the situations that they're in. Howard's marriage problems line up too perfectly with Howard's depression in the aftermath of Chuck's death to just be a coincidence. So that, along with the fact that Cheryl doesn't seem to support his namaste lifestyle, all leads me to believe that they started having relationship problems due to the way that Howard was processing Chuck's death, including his depression, along with how Howard decided to act afterwards. All of these tangents about Howard's hardships are to say that one way or another they can all be linked back to Chuck's death, either directly or indirectly, along with Howard's grief and guilt over the situation, both which were caused by Jimmy, both intentionally and unintentionally. Jimmy unintentionally caused Chuck and Howard's feud, which resulted in Howard's death by forcing Chuck to quit, along with Chuck's death. Jimmy then intentionally pushed all the blame of it onto Howard, which obviously caused Howard's depression, but also potentially his marriage problems too. Although Howard, quote, always lands on his feet eventually, he still had to deal with so much because of it. Speaking of Howard landing on his feet, let's talk about the final malicious act that Jimmy helped orchestrate against Howard that caused his death, the mediator con, along with everything that Jimmy and Kim did in season 6 leading up to it. Now, I'm gonna try and get to the point here and keep a long story short, as I'm not about to recap everything that Jimmy and Kim did to Howard throughout season 6, save that for a season 6 tier list, along with the mediator con itself, as I've already done an entire video discussing that in great detail on the channel. The thing is, to link Howard's death back to Chuck's, there was a huge lesson for Jimmy to learn in Chuck's death, which he never did. The lesson that Jimmy never learned was that being petty and messing with someone in an originally insignificant and temporary way can yield significant and permanent damage. Jimmy messed with Chuck's insurance, which eventually resulted in the unintended consequence of Chuck's death. Likewise, messing with Howard to force Sandpiper to settle resulted in the unintended consequence of Howard being killed by Lalo. And to stand on a soapbox for a moment because I already have a gut feeling I'm gonna get comments about it, no, Jimmy and Kim didn't pull the trigger, Lalo did. Even so, Jimmy and Kim are still guilty for Howard's death due to them provoking Howard to be at the wrong place in the wrong time. I've gotten many comments defending Jimmy and Kim for not being at fault for Howard's death and instead blaming Lalo since he actually committed the deed. Again, broken record here, but I love this show due to the many interpretations that you can have about situations such like this, so blaming Lalo is a logical opinion that makes sense. That being said, having that opinion and leaving it as just that seems to be taking things at face value and not reading between the lines as the creators intended. Many times in interviews during the Insider podcast and on Twitter, the creators confirmed that the whole point of Howard's death was to show Jimmy and Kim the unintended consequences of their actions, and that they are truly guilty for Howard's death, even though Lalo pulled the trigger. Tom Schnauz also wrote and directed episode 607 and admitted this many times that this was his full intention, whether in the Insider podcast or in the Gilliverse podcast or on Twitter. So just like how it was the creators' intentions for Jimmy to secretly be guilty for Chuck's death, even though it's not like Jimmy pushed over the lantern, Jimmy and Kim are both guilty for Howard's death, even though they didn't literally pull the trigger. Also, even though Kim was the true mastermind behind the mediation con and forcing Sandpiper to settle in general, pushing Jimmy to make it happen every step along the way since the season 6 premiere and even the season 5 finale, Jimmy is still an accomplice, even if he was reluctant to do it. So with the fault honestly split with like 60% Kim to 40% Jimmy, at the end of the day they're both guilty, with Howard's death meant to open their eyes about their actions for various reasons. With Kim, she had blinders on throughout all of season 6 to what she was truly doing, and Howard's death was to make her realize the unintended consequences to her actions messing with Cliff and Howard all season, something that she finally admitted to Jimmy during their breakup scene near the end of 609. And then with Jimmy, as I said earlier, it was to get him to realize the unintended consequences that, although being petty and messing with someone may seem like an insignificant low blow in the moment, it can result in permanent damage. Jimmy should have learned this lesson when he messed with Chuck's insurance, which unintentionally led to Chuck's death, but he didn't. Now, he's repeated the same mistake with Howard by forcing Sandpiper to settle, which obviously resulted in Howard's death as well. I just find it interesting how Tom Schnauz wrote and directed both 307 when Jimmy messed with Chuck's insurance and 607 when Howard dies, with Tom saying on the record how this is a clear parallel with Jimmy never realizing the lesson that he should have learned for Chuck's death, so he caused Howard's death in the same way as well. So although Kim admitted her wrongdoings to Jimmy in 609, Jimmy never admitted his wrongdoings to her or anyone else throughout the entirety of the Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad timeline. Jimmy never told Kim the truth about how he messed with Chuck's insurance, and now both Chuck and Howard have died while never learning the truth. As if it wasn't already bad enough for Chuck, it was horrible for Howard as well since he took the full blame for Chuck's death and died believing he was at fault for Chuck unaliving himself. This finally loops us into the series finale to Better Call Saul, episode 613, when Jimmy is in the courtroom. The final thing that Jimmy brings up while on the stand before sitting down is Chuck. Jimmy says how he tried so hard to mend his brotherly relationship, but that he could have tried harder, which in itself is not only a reference to the entire first 3 seasons of the show, but also potentially the Chuck flashback, which we'll discuss more in just a moment. Then Jimmy admits that he got Chuck's malpractice insurance canceled and that he took away the one thing that Chuck lived for, which was the law. Jimmy states that after that, Chuck took his own life and that Jimmy has had to secretly live with that truth all of these years. This proves that Jimmy knows that he was guilty for Chuck's death, but bottled it up for the better part of 7 years, never telling a soul. This also proves that although Jimmy had compartmentalized his feelings about Chuck's death, that deep down he did feel remorse for it, but was unable to acknowledge it until now.
When I saw a chance to hurt him, I took it. I got his malpractice insurance canceled. I took away the one thing he lived for, the law. After that, he killed himself. And I'll live with that.
When Jimmy sits down, Oakley wonders why Jimmy even said that stuff about Chuck, as it's not a crime. Jimmy argues that it is a crime, maybe not literally, but instead ethically.
What was all that? That thing with your brother, that wasn't even a crime.
It was.
Sadly, Jimmy finally admitting his actions messing with Chuck's insurance is seemingly too little too late, as the damage is done with both Chuck and Howard long dead by this point. Chuck died in 2003, Howard died in 2004, and the Gene scenes don't take place until late 2010. That being said, it was still a nice gesture for Jimmy to admit it not only out loud to Kim, but on the record in court as well. To circle back to what I said at the beginning of the video, Jimmy's secret of messing with Chuck's insurance was a huge unanswered question throughout the entire second half of the show, wondering if Jimmy would ever admit it or if he would eventually take it to the grave. This, in my opinion, finally gives closure to Jimmy's darkest secret, which he's kept to himself all of these years. Jimmy admitting this in court, along with the Chuck flashback in 613, gives a perfect bookend to the Jimmy and Chuck brotherly dynamic throughout the show, and was a great callback conclusion considering it was rarely mentioned in the final few seasons. Also, episode 613 has this theme of regret, as Jimmy is shown in flashbacks with Mike, Walt, and Chuck discussing it. This originates with Jimmy asking Mike what they'd do if they created a time machine, with Mike being the one to redirect it into a conversation about regret. With Mike, he asked Jimmy if there's anything he'd go back and change, which he didn't really give an answer to.
That's it, buddy.
What else?
Nothing you change.
I'm rested.
While with Walt, he flat out calls Jimmy out about having regrets, which again, Jimmy doesn't give a sincere answer.
So what about you? What regrets? You know, never mind.
When I was 22, I pulled a slip and fall outside Marshall Field.
A slip and fall.
Yeah, that's how I put myself through bartending school.
Although this can all be summed up to one question, what does Jimmy regret most? I like to think that 613 asks this questions in two parts, first with Mike, then Walt. 1. What does Jimmy wish that he could go back and change? And 2. What does Jimmy regret the most? I like to think that we get answers to both of these similar questions in 613 with the Chuck flashback, along with Jimmy admitting how he messed with Chuck's insurance. So the thing that Jimmy wishes he could go back and change would be to have the heart-to-heart that he never allowed himself to have with Chuck during the Chuck flashback, as it was one of the rare moments when Chuck was willing to open himself up to Jimmy, but Jimmy declined. This is ironic because usually it's the other way around, with Jimmy constantly wanting to open up to Chuck throughout the first 3 seasons, while Chuck usually declined. And then, in my opinion, the thing that Jimmy regrets the most is the main topic of this video that has strung together this whole analysis, the fact that Jimmy messed with Chuck's malpractice insurance, which unintentionally caused Chuck's death, and Jimmy finally admitted to in the series finale. Since Better Call Saul was mainly built on the Chuck and Jimmy dynamic throughout the first 3 seasons, it makes me so happy that the Better Call Saul series finale acknowledged it in such a huge way, especially when the 2010 Gene timeline is so far removed from those early 2002 to 2003 episodes. Peter Gould, who wrote and directed 613, admitted that he added the idea of a Chuck flashback only after finishing the rest of the script for 613, as the episode originally felt like it was missing something. I'm so glad that he did, as it's a perfect callback conclusion to the roots that the show was built on, along with the fact that we never saw Chuck at all during Better Call Saul Season 5 or Season 6 until the flashback in this very last episode. It's true what Michael McKean, Chuck's actor, once said, that if they brought Chuck back too many times that it would diminish the impact of Chuck's death. This may be why we never saw a Chuck flashback in Season 5 after getting 2 of them during Season 4. But it also worked out in the show's favor as it made the 613 Chuck flashback, along with Jimmy mentioning what he did to Chuck's insurance in court, so much more impactful. Now this video turned out to be so much more than I had originally intended, but in a way I'm thankful for that. Originally, this video was intended to be a companion video alongside my Season 3 tier list, which I was scripting during the time that Better Call Saul Season 6 Part 1 was airing. So if you've seen my Season 3 tier list, this video is what I was talking about when I was recapping episode 307 and the insurance scene. That's also why I tweeted Tom Schnoz about it back in June of this year, showing how this discussion was planned way back then. And then, once Howard's death happened in 607 to conclude Season 6 Part 1, I decided to link this discussion to Howard's death after I uploaded my Season 3 tier list during the Season 6 mid-season break. Meanwhile, I was so preoccupied with other Season 6 content during the mid-season break that this companion video was left on the back burner, and before I knew it, Season 6 Part 2 was already airing. So I ended up leaving this video on the side until Season 6 concluded, which in retrospect, I'm happy that it turned out this way, as it allowed me to incorporate important aspects of the series finale into this discussion, since Jimmy finally did admit how he screwed over Chuck's insurance. So with that being said, let me know what you think about all of this in the comments. From Jimmy originally messing with Chuck's insurance, how Tom confirmed it was something Jimmy decided in the moment, how it affected other characters such as Chuck, Howard, and Kim, indirectly resulting in the deaths of Chuck and Howard, along with Jimmy potentially redeeming himself by admitting it during the series finale. Now, was Jimmy able to fully redeem himself by admitting his deepest, darkest secret in court? Do you think it finally brings justice to what he did, or was it too little too late? Do you commend Jimmy for being so genuine in doing so, or do you think he just did it in a shallow way to get Kim to like him again? In my opinion, I feel like it's a mix of both, as Jimmy definitely did feel remorse after all these years, but he also did want to say anything he could to win Kim over, to the point that there's enough to discuss here to create an entirely different video on. So, actually, bonus question for the comments. Would you like to see a video analysis on if Jimmy truly did redeem himself by what he said in the courtroom during 613 to win Kim over? Let me know, I may add it to the list of upcoming videos. I'd appreciate a like on this video if you've enjoyed anything I've said today. If you're new to the channel or just haven't yet already, subscribe and hit that bell notification to stay updated on when I post new content on Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Check out my Patreon or give a super thanks in the comments to help support the channel financially. But most importantly, I thank you all so much for watching, and until next time, I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out!
The name's McGill. I'm James McGill.
Why are you putting yourself through all this?
Because I wanted to tell you
That you have regrets. And I'm telling you, don't bother. What's the point?